The air in the Lawson chapel was always thick, not with the familiar scent of pine boards and candle wax, but with something heavier, something ancient and suffocating. On that cold October Sunday in 1844, the weight was unbearable. 5 families sat huddled in the crude pews, their faces pale masks of dread, their eyes fixed not on the altar, but on the small, still form of 8-year-old Martha Gable. She lay upon a makeshift bier before the pulpit, her hands folded over a dress of white cotton, her skin the color of milk. She was the fifth child to be struck down by the mysterious affliction that had plagued the small, isolated community of Cinder Hollow, Tennessee. The 5th child to fall ill during a sermon and perish before the next dawn. Outside, a bitter wind howled through the skeletal trees of the Appalachian foothills, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the whispers of the dead. Inside, there was only a chilling, unnatural silence, broken by the quiet, rhythmic cadence of one man's voice. Reverend Alastair Blackwood stood at his pulpit, his tall, gaunt frame a silhouette against the gray light filtering through the chapel's single window. His eyes, dark and deep-set, swept over his terrified flock, offering no comfort, only a grim, unwavering certainty. "The Lord gives," he intoned, his voice a low rumble that filled every corner of the small room, "and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." For the parents of the dead, these words were not a solace but a terrifying indictment. They felt a creeping horror that the taking was not being done by a benevolent God, but by something else entirely. Something that had followed this strange, charismatic preacher into their valley. Something that now lived within the very walls of the Lawson Chapel, a place of worship that had become a tomb. No one spoke of it aloud, but the thought was a venomous seed planted in every mind. No child who entered this chapel for a sermon had survived. To understand the terror that gripped Cinder Hollow, one must first understand the place itself. In 1844, this small pocket of humanity, nestled deep in the unforgiving wilderness of eastern Tennessee, was a world unto itself. It was a place of stark contrasts, of breathtaking beauty and profound isolation. The nearest town was a 2-day ride by horse, a journey fraught with peril. The people of the hollow were hardened by the land, their lives dictated by the turning of the seasons, and the will of a God who felt both intimately close and terrifyingly distant. They were deeply pious, their faith a raw, unfiltered thing, forged in hardship and nurtured by an unwavering belief in Scripture. For years, they had worshipped in their own homes, their prayers rising to the heavens without the guidance of an ordained minister. The dream of a proper church, a consecrated house of the Lord, was a desperate, shared longing. It was this dream that drove Jedediah Lawson, a stern but respected farmer, to donate a pristine acre of his land at the heart of the valley. He, along with his wife and their neighbors, felled the timber themselves, hewing the logs with calloused hands and raising the walls of what would become the Lawson Chapel. It was meant to be a symbol of hope, a testament to their devotion, a sanctuary against the darkness of the wilderness that pressed in on all sides. They built it with sweat and prayer, believing they were creating a fortress for their souls. They could not have known they were building a slaughterhouse for their children. The final shingle was laid in the spring of 1844, a proud moment for the small community. But the chapel stood empty, a silent monument waiting for a voice. It needed a shepherd. And in the late summer, as if summoned by their collective prayer, he arrived. Reverend Alastair Blackwood appeared as if from the earth itself. He rode into Cinder Hollow on a gaunt black horse, a solitary figure cloaked in black, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He was not like the circuit preachers who occasionally pass through these remote parts, men with weathered faces and simple words. Blackwood possessed a stark, almost aristocratic bearing. He was unnervingly handsome, with a pale complexion that seemed untouched by the sun, and eyes so dark they appeared to swallow the light. His voice was his most potent instrument. It could drop to a conspiratorial whisper that drew listeners in, or rise to a thunderous crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. He carried with him a single, heavy, leather-bound Bible and a letter of introduction from a diocese no one had ever heard of. He claimed he had been called by God to serve in the most remote, forgotten corners of the land, to bring the word to those who thirsted for it most. The people of Cinder Hollow, desperate for spiritual leadership, were utterly captivated. He spoke of sin and redemption, of fire and grace, with an intensity that was both illing and terrifying. His sermons were not comforting parables. They were macabre explorations of damnation, of the fragility of the soul in a world rife with temptation. He painted vivid, horrifying pictures of the torments that awaited the unrighteous, making the promise of salvation seem all the more urgent. When the elders, led by Jedediah Lawson, offered him the pulpit at their new chapel, he accepted with a solemn, almost sorrowful nod, as if accepting a great and terrible burden. The community rejoiced. They believed they had been blessed with a true man of God. This belief would soon curdle into the most disturbing, forbidden suspicion imaginable. The first sermon was a momentous occasion. On the first Sunday of September, the entire community of Cinder Hollow, some 50 souls in all, gathered at the Lawson Chapel. The interior smelled sharply of fresh-cut pine and earnest hope. Families filled the pews, the children scrubbed clean and restless in their Sunday best. Among them was the Lawson family themselves, their 7-year-old daughter Elspeth sitting between them, her bright eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Reverend Blackwood ascended the pulpit, and a hush fell over the congregation. He did not begin with a gentle prayer or a welcoming hymn. Instead, he opened his Bible and read from the book of Job, his voice a low, mesmerizing hum. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, his words weaving a hypnotic spell. He described the world as a battleground between God and Satan, a place where the souls of the innocent were the ultimate prize. He spoke of trials and tribulations not as obstacles, but as divine tests designed to purify the faithful. Even your children, he declared, his gaze sweeping over the youngest faces in the room, are not spared the crucible. Their purity makes them a beacon, a tempting fruit for the forces of darkness. But rejoice, for if God calls them home in their innocence, they are saved from the inevitable corruption of this fallen world. The words were unsettling, yet delivered with such profound conviction that the congregation was left breathless, their hearts pounding with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. They left the chapel that day feeling spiritually scoured, deeply uneasy, but certain they had heard the unvarnished truth. That evening, as the sun set behind the jagged peaks, young Elspeth Lawson began to complain of a chill. Her parents put her to bed, assuming it was a passing fever. By morning, she was gone. The death of a child in 1844 was a tragic but not uncommon event. Fevers, agues, and fluxes were constant, unseen predators in these isolated communities. Dr. Silas Croft, a man of medicine who served 3 valleys and was more often paid in chickens than in coin, was summoned. He was a practical, sober man, his hands roughened by experience, his eyes accustomed to seeing the worst of what nature could inflict. He examined Elspeth Lawson's small, cold body, searching for the familiar signs of disease, the rash of measles, the swollen glands of mumps, the telltale cough of consumption. He found none. The child appeared strangely peaceful, almost untouched, as if she had simply willed her own heart to stop beating. Her skin was pale and cool, but not discolored. There were no marks, no signs of struggle. Dr. Croft was perplexed. He noted a peculiar listlessness in the hours before her death, a glassy, vacant look in her eyes, as her parents described it. He ultimately recorded the cause of death as a sudden and virulent fever of unknown origin, a diagnosis that satisfied the official record but did nothing to ease the quiet disquiet in his own mind. The community rallied around the Lawsons, their grief sharp and communal. Reverend Blackwood presided over the funeral, delivering a eulogy that was both heartbreaking and strangely triumphant. He spoke of Elspeth as a chosen lamb, plucked from the flock by the shepherd himself, her soul now safe in the arms of the Almighty, spared from the sins and sorrows of earthly life. His words brought a strange, cold comfort to some, but for Jedediah and his wife, they felt like salt in a gaping wound. They had prayed for a church, and the first offering it had taken was their own daughter. It felt like a cruel, macabre bargain, a forbidden thought they quickly pushed away, blaming their grief. They couldn't know this was just the beginning of their horrifying ordeal. The following Sunday, a palpable gloom hung over the Lawson chapel. The Lawsons were absent, locked away with their grief, but the rest of the community returned, driven by a mixture of faith, duty, and a morbid curiosity. They needed to believe that what happened to Elspeth was a random act of God, a tragic anomaly. To abandon the church now would be to admit that some darker force was at play. Reverend Blackwood's sermon that day was even more intense than the first. He seemed to feed on the fear and sorrow in the room, his voic, rising with fiery passion. He spoke of sacrifice, of Abraham and Isaac, of God's demand for the ultimate proof of faith. "What is your love for your child?" he thundered, his dark eyes seeming to pierce each parent's soul, "compared to your love for the Creator? Is it not the purest form of worship to surrender that which you hold most dear without question?" The air grew thick with tension. The parents in the pews instinctively pulled their children closer. Among them sat the Miller family with their boisterous 6-year-old son, Thomas. The boy, who had been fidgeting and restless, suddenly grew still. His head lolled to one side, his eyes taking on the same vacant, glassy sheen that Elspeth Lawson's parents had described. His mother, noticing the change, tried to rouse him, but he was unresponsive, lost in a silent stupor. She carried him from the chapel in a panic, his small body limp in her arms. The sermon continued, uninterrupted. That night, a frantic messenger on horseback roused Dr. Croft from his sleep. He arrived at the Miller cabin to find the family gathered around the small bed, their faces illuminated by a single flickering lantern. Thomas was dead. He had passed just as quietly as Elspeth, without a fever, without a struggle, simply slipping away into an eternal silence. The death of Thomas Miller sent a shockwave of genuine fear through Cinder Hollow. 2 sermons, 2 children dead. The pattern was impossible to ignore. What had once been a source of pride and hope, the Lawson Chapel, was now becoming a source of a creeping, unspoken dread. Whispers began to circulate, quiet and fearful, in the privacy of cabins and around nighttime fires. They were the kind of dark, superstitious thoughts that reason and faith were supposed to keep at bay. Some spoke of a curse upon the land where the chapel was built, claiming it was an old, forbidden burial ground of the native tribes who had come before. Others wondered about the wood itself, if the trees used to build the church had been blighted by some unseen evil. The most disturbing whispers, however, centered on Reverend Blackwood himself. Where had he truly come from? Why did his sermons, meant to bring comfort, seem to coincide with such inexplicable tragedy? His focus on the purity of children and the nobility of their early death now seemed less like theological doctrine and more like a macabre obsession. Dr. Silas Croft was now deeply alarmed. 2 identical deaths, with no discernible natural cause in the exact same circumstances, was not a coincidence. It was a medical impossibility. He returned to his notes on Elspeth Lawson, comparing them with his examination of Thomas Miller. The symptoms were identical: a sudden onset of lethargy and disorientation during the sermon, followed by a quiet death within hours. It was as if their life force was simply being extinguished. He felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. This was not the work of God or nature. This was something else, something methodical, something malevolent. But how could a man's words, a sermon, possibly kill a child? The question was absurd, yet the evidence was horrifyingly real. He knew he had to find an answer before the bell of the Lawson Chapel tolled again. Fear is a contagion, and in the isolated confines of Cinder Hollow, it spread faster than any fever. By the 3rd Sunday, the congregation that gathered at the Lawson Chapel was noticeably smaller. Several families with young children stayed home, their doors bolted, choosing to risk divine displeasure over a more immediate, tangible threat. Those who did attend wore their anxiety like a shroud. They watched their children with a hawk-like vigilance, ready to flee at the slightest sign of distress. Jedediah Lawson, his face a mask of grief and confusion, was there. His presence was a silent, desperate plea for answers, for a sign that his daughter's death was not in vain. Reverend Blackwood seemed oblivious to the terror he was creating, or perhaps, more chillingly, he reveled in it. He took to the pulpit and delivered a sermon on the sin of doubt. He condemned the weak of faith who hid in their homes, who listened to the serpent's whisper of fear instead of the word of God. "Satan walks among you now," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the half-empty chapel. "He seeks to turn you from this holy place. He uses your love for your children as a weapon against your love for the Lord." His eyes scanned the remaining children, lingering on 5-year-old Sarah Blevins, a frail girl with hair the color of corn silk. "Do not let him win," the Reverend implored, his voice dropping to a seductive whisper. "Trust in God's plan, even when it is shrouded in mystery and pain." As he spoke, Sarah, who had been drawing on a small piece of slate, let it fall from her numb fingers. It clattered on the wooden floor with a sound that was deafening in the silence. Her mother scooped her up, her heart seizing with icy panic. The girl's eyes had the look, the vacant, faraway stare. The third sermon had claimed its victim. The death of Sarah Blevins shattered the last vestiges of denial in Cinder Hollow. The pattern was now an undeniable, horrifying truth. 3 Sundays, 3 sermons, 3 dead children. The chapel was no longer seen as a house of God. It was viewed as a gateway to the grave. Panic gave way to a simmering anger and the community fractured. A delegation of men, led by Sarah's enraged father, confronted Jedediah Lawson, blaming him for bringing this curse upon them by building the chapel. Fights broke out. Accusations flew like poisoned arrows. The tight-knit fabric of the community was unraveling, thread by thread, replaced by suspicion and paranoia. Neighbors who had shared bread now glared at each other over fence lines, wondering who was a true believer and who was a harbinger of the evil that had befallen them. In the midst of this chaos, Dr. Silas Croft worked with a grim urgency. He felt like a man trying to solve a riddle in a language he did not understand. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the children were being poisoned. But how, and with what? There were no common poisons in the valley that produced such quiet, subtle symptoms. No signs of convulsions, no foaming at the mouth, no discoloration that pointed to arsenic or nightshade. It was a silent, invisible killer. His suspicions fell squarely on Reverend Blackwood. The man was the only common denominator. He was the eye of the storm. Croft began a discreet investigation into the preacher's life at the small parsonage where he boarded. He interviewed the woman who owned the house, asking about the Reverend's habits, his meals, the contents of the satchels he always kept locked. He learned little, other than the fact that Blackwood spent hours alone in his room, reading and writing, and took long, solitary walks in the woods, often returning with bundles of unfamiliar herbs and fungi. The detail was small, but it was a start. A horrifying, macabre thought began to take root in the doctor's mind. The poison wasn't in the air or in the water. It was being administered. While the community tore itself apart with fear and accusation, Reverend Blackwood's influence over a core group of followers only grew stronger. He gathered them close, a flock of the truly devout, and preyed upon their terror. He presented the deaths not as a tragedy, but as a sign of their elevated status in the eyes of God. He told them that Cinder Hollow had been chosen for a great and terrible trial, a test of faith unlike any other. The children, he explained, were not victims but martyrs, their innocent souls offered up as a bulwark against a tide of encroaching evil. "The world outside this valley is drowning in sin," he preached to them in private gatherings, his voice hypnotic and low. "God is cleansing the earth, and he has begun here, with the purest among us. These children are the first fruits of a bitter harvest, a sacrifice to sanctify this land." He convinced them that their fear was a weakness, a sin, and that the only path to salvation was through unwavering, unquestioning obedience to his guidance. This core group, which included the still grieving and deeply confused Jedediah Lawson, became a protective wall around the Reverend. They saw him as a prophet, a misunderstood visionary. They viewed the other townsfolk, those who now shunned the chapel and whispered of curses, as heretics and cowards. The division was now complete. Cinder Hollow was no longer a community, it was 2 warring camps. On one side were those who saw a devil in their midst, and on the other those who saw a savior. The Lawson Chapel stood between them, a silent, brooding edifice of splintering wood and shattered faith. The stage was being set for a confrontation, and Silas Croft knew he was running out of time before the next Sunday, before the bell tolled for another innocent child. The thought was a constant, sickening weight in his gut. Dr. Croft's investigation led him into the dark, tangled woods that surrounded Cinder Hollow. Armed with the knowledge of Blackwood's solitary walks and his interest in local flora, the doctor began his own search. He was not a botanist, but he was a man of the mountains, familiar with the common plants, the healing herbs and the poisonous weeds. He searched the areas around the paths Blackwood was known to frequent, his eyes scanning the forest floor for anything unusual. For days he found nothing but the familiar foliage of the Appalachians. But then in a damp, shaded hollow near a stagnant creek he found it, a small, unassuming patch of mushrooms. They were pale, almost spectral in the dim light, with delicate, web-like veils hanging from their caps. He had never seen their like before. There was something inherently sinister about them, an aura of quiet lethality. He carefully harvested several specimens, wrapping them. His handkerchief, a feeling of cold dread mixed with a grim sense of discovery washing over him. He had a strong, instinctual feeling that he held the key to the Cinder Hollow depths in his hand. But instinct was not proof. He needed to know what this fungus was and what it could do. The nearest person with such knowledge was an old woman locals called Granny Hoot, a recluse who lived deeper in the mountains, a woman rumored to be a practitioner of folk magic and herbal remedies, a person most folks were too scared to even approach. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. Approaching her could brand him as a trafficker in the dark arts, but the alternative, allowing another child to die, was unthinkable. He had to know what secrets the pale, ghostly mushrooms held. If you are finding this descent into the macabre history of the Lawson Chapel compelling, consider subscribing to our channel. We are dedicated to unearthing the most disturbing and forbidden cold cases from the darkest corners of the past. And the horrifying truth Silas was about to uncover is something official history has tried to bury forever. The journey to Granny Hoot's cabin was a journey into the heart of the region's folklore. Silas Croft traveled for half a day, leaving the familiar paths behind and venturing into a part of the forest that was wilder, darker, and steeped in local superstition. The cabin itself was barely more than a hovel, built into the side of a hill and covered in moss, seeming to grow from the earth itself. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, the only sign of life. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the rough-hewn door. It creaked open to reveal a woman who looked as ancient as the mountains themselves. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. She listened in silence as Silas, his voice low and urgent, explained the strange deaths in Cinder Hollow and presented the mushrooms he had found. The old woman took one of the specimens, her gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle. She turned it over, sniffed it, and then her eyes narrowed. "Ah," she rasped, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "The angel's shroud, the quiet taker." She explained that it was a rare and lethally toxic fungus. It was not a fast-acting poison that caused violent convulsions. Its effects were far more insidious, more macabre. It attacked the nerves, slowly shutting down the body's functions. The first stage was a dreamlike state of paralysis, a waking stupor where the victim was conscious but unable to move or speak, their eyes wide and glassy. This would be followed by a gradual, painless cessation of the heart and lungs. It was a poison that mimicked a peaceful death, a poison that would leave almost no trace, a poison perfectly suited for a killer who wished to mask their work as an act of God. Silas felt a horrifying clarity descend upon him. The glassy stares, the lethargy, the quiet deaths, it all made perfect sense. But one crucial question remained. How was Blackwood administering it? Armed with this terrifying knowledge, Silas Croft now saw Reverend Blackwood not as a misguided fanatic but as a cunning and methodical serial killer. The chapel was not a cursed ground. It was a carefully chosen hunting ground. The sermons were not the cause of death. They were the delivery mechanism. He replayed the events of the past 3 Sundays in his mind, searching for the moment, the vector, through which the poison was passed. It had to be something the children consumed, something they all shared. The communion wine. No, the children were often too young to partake. The well water outside the chapel, possible, but adults drank from it as well, and none had fallen ill. Why only the children? The question tormented him. He realized he needed to get inside the chapel, not as a worshiper, but as an investigator. He needed to examine the place when it was empty, to search for Blackwood's hidden store of the poison, the angel's shroud. The risk was immense. If he were caught by Blackwood or one of his devout followers, he would be branded a heretic, a blasphemer desecrating a holy place. In the heightened state of paranoia gripping the Hollow, such an accusation could easily get him killed. But the image of another small coffin being lowered into the hard Tennessee soil gave him the courage he needed. He would wait for the night before the next sermon, Saturday night, when the moon was new and the darkness was deepest. He would break into the Lawson chapel and search for the devil's pantry. He felt a grim certainty that the answers were hidden somewhere within those cursed walls, within the reach of the pulpit from which Alistair Blackwood delivered his sermons of death. Saturday night descended on Cinder Hollow like a black sheet. The air was cold and still, the silence of the valley absolute. Under the cloak of a moonless sky, Silas Croft moved like a ghost through the sleeping community, his medical bag out carrying not instruments of healing but tools for a far darker purpose, a pry bar and a lantern with its light heavily shielded. He reached the clearing where the Lawson chapel stood, a stark, angular shadow against the stardusted sky. The building seemed to watch him, its single dark window like a baleful eye. He listened for long minutes, every nerve on edge, but the only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart. With painstaking care, he worked the pry bar into the jamb of the main door. The wood groaned in protest, a sound that seemed to scream across the silent valley. He froze, expecting to hear a shout, to see the light of a lantern approaching. Nothing. He applied more pressure, and with a final, sickening crack, the lock splintered and the door swung inward, opening into a maw of absolute blackness. He slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind him. He unshielded his lantern, and the weak, flickering light pushed back the oppressive darkness, revealing the familiar pews, the aisle, and at the far end, the pulpit. The air inside was colder than it was outside, and it carried a faint, cloying, sweetish odor like damp, decaying earth. It was the smell of the angel's shroud. He was in the right place. His search began at the pulpit, the epicenter of Blackwood's power. It was a simple wooden structure, but as his hands explored its surfaces, he felt a small, almost imperceptible seam in the front panel. It was a hidden compartment. With his heart pounding against his ribs, Silas used the tip of a knife to carefully work open the hidden compartment in the pulpit. The panel swung open with a soft click, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside, nestled on a piece of black velvet, were the instruments of a killer. There was a small stone mortar and pestle, its surface stained with a faint white powder. Beside it lay a collection of dried mushrooms, the same pale, spectral angel's shroud he had found in the woods. And next to them, the most damning piece of evidence, a small, hollowed-out reed, no thicker than a child's finger. The horrifying method of delivery became instantly, sickeningly clear. Blackwood wasn't poisoning their food or drink. He was using the air itself. During the most fervent, emotionally charged moments of his sermons, when the congregation was captivated, their attention fixed upon him, he was using the reed as a blowpipe, puffing a fine, nearly invisible cloud of powdered spores toward his chosen victim. The children, sitting in the front pews, would be the most vulnerable, inhaling the lightweight, airborne poison without even realizing it. The sweet, earthy smell he had noticed in the chapel was the lingering residue of this macabre act. It was a method of murder so audacious, so diabolical, it was almost beyond comprehension. He was committing the perfect crime, hiding his actions in plain sight, using the passion of the sermon as a cover for the cold, calculated act of murder. Silas carefully took a small sample of the powder, wrapped it in a piece of cloth, and closed the secret panel. He now had the proof he needed. But proof was one thing. Confronting a man who had convinced half the valley he was a prophet was another. He had to expose Blackwood, and he had to do it tomorrow, during the sermon, before another child could be chosen. As dawn broke on the fourth Sunday, Silas Croft did not prepare his medical bag. Instead, he prepared for war. He knew he could not simply stand up and accuse the Reverend. Blackwood's followers were so deeply under his spell they would likely turn on Silas, seeing him as an agent of Satan trying to silence their prophet. He needed to do more than just present evidence. He needed to break the spell. He needed to show them the man, not the prophet. His plan was risky, bordering on suicidal, but it was the only one he had. He went first to the Blevins family, the parents of Sarah, the third victim. Their grief had hardened into a cold, desperate rage. He showed them the powdered mushroom, explained its insidious effects, and detailed his horrifying discovery in the chapel pulpit. He needed them, he explained, not to fight, but to watch. He instructed Mr. Blevins to position himself near the chapel door and to act only on his signal. He then visited the Millers and the Lawsons. To the Millers he gave a similar warning, but for Jedediah Lawson, the first to suffer and the most devout of Blackwood's followers, he had a different, more difficult task. He found Jedediah preparing to attend the service, his face a grim mask of tortured faith. Silas laid out the entire Macabre theory, from the mushrooms to the blowpipe. He could see the conflict warring in the man's eyes, the desire to believe in his pastor warring with the undeniable, horrifying pattern of death. "I am not asking you to believe me, Jedediah," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. "I am asking you to watch. Watch his hands during the sermon. Watch where his eyes linger. And be ready." He left the farmer standing in his doorway, a man balanced on the knife's edge between devotion and a terrible, dawning comprehension. The congregation that gathered for the fourth sermon was the smallest yet. It was comprised almost entirely of Blackwood's core followers, their faces set with a grim, defiant piety. The air was thick with a self-righteous tension. They were the faithful, the chosen few who had not abandoned their shepherd. The families of the dead were also there, a fact that did not go unnoticed. The Lawsons, the Millers, and the Blevins sat in the back, their presence a silent, heavy accusation. Silas Croft took a seat in the very last pew, positioning himself where he could see both the pulpit and the chapel door. He felt the hostile glares of the faithful upon him, but his attention was fixed solely on the man who now ascended the pulpit. Reverend Blackwood seemed to relish the atmosphere of conflict. He began his sermon with a voice like rolling thunder, condemning the faithless, the doubters who had turned their backs on God. He praised the small flock before him, calling them his true believers. As his sermon built in intensity, Silas watched his every move, his every gesture. He saw the way Blackwood's left hand, hidden from the view of most of the congregation by the lip of the pulpit, would occasionally dip out of sight. He saw the way the Reverend's eyes, like a predator's, scanned the few remaining children in the room as if making a selection. His gaze settled on a young boy, barely 4 years old, sitting with his mother in the second row. The boy was coughing, a small, wet sound. He was the perfect target, a child already perceived as sickly, whose death could be easily explained away. Silas felt a cold dread wash over him. The performance was beginning. Reverend Blackwood's sermon reached a fever pitch. He was speaking of angels, of God sending his messengers to gather the purest souls before they could be tainted by the world. His eyes were locked on the coughing boy, his words a mesmerizing, terrifying lullaby of death. "And the angel descends," he cried out, his right hand gesturing dramatically towards the heavens. At that exact moment, Silas saw it. Blackwood's left hand, quick as a viper's strike, darted into the hidden compartment. He brought the small reed to his lips, shielded by the large, open Bible that lay on the pulpit. It was the moment Silas had been waiting for. "Now," he shouted, his voice cracking through the hypnotic drone of the sermon. The word was a gunshot in the silent chapel. Every head turned towards him. Blackwood froze, the reed still at his lips, his eyes wide with shock and fury. Before anyone could react, Silas was already moving, striding down the central aisle directly towards the pulpit. "He's a murderer," Silas yelled, pointing a trembling finger at the preacher. "The sickness is not from God. It is from a poison he keeps hidden in that very pulpit." Chaos erupted. Blackwood's followers, jolted from their trance, surged to their feet, their faces contorted with rage. They saw Silas not as a savior, but as a desecrator, a madman interrupting a holy service. "Blasphemer!" one of them screamed, moving to block Silas's path. But from the back of the chapel, another man was also moving. Mr. Blevins, his face a terrifying mask of vengeful grief, let out a guttural roar and charged forward, his only thought to get his hands on the man who had murdered his daughter. The spell was broken, and the Lawson chapel descended into a pandemonium of violence and raw, primal fury. The small chapel became a scene of pure bedlam. Mr. Blevins, fueled by a father's rage, threw himself at the men trying to protect Blackwood, clearing a path for Silas. The doctor reached the pulpit just as the reverend, his face a snarl of reptilian hatred, was trying to conceal the reed and the powdered mushrooms. Silas grabbed the man's wrist, forcing his hand open. The pale powder and the hollow reed fell onto the open Bible for all to see. "Here is your plague," Silas roared to the stunned congregation. "Not a curse, but a coward's poison, the angel's shroud. He has been puffing this into the faces of your children." A collective gasp of horror rippled through the room. The sight of the physical evidence, the very substance that had stolen their children, was undeniable. Jedediah Lawson, who had been frozen in his pew, stared at the powder on the Bible page, and the last vestiges of his faith in Blackwood shattered, replaced by a wave of sickening understanding. He had not just followed this man, he had defended him. He had brought this wolf into the fold. With a cry of anguish, he too lunged forward. The remaining followers of Blackwood, their certainty now fractured by the horrifying proof before them, backed away, their faces a mixture of confusion, terror, and dawning guilt. They were no longer protecting a prophet, they were shielding a monster. The confrontatio N was no longer about faith, but about a far simpler, more brutal justice. The men of Cinder Hollow, led by the fathers of the dead, closed in on Alistair Blackwood, their faces grim, their intentions written in the hard set of their jaws and the clenching of their fists. There would be no trial. There would only be a reckoning. What happened next was never recorded in any official document. It became a dark, forbidden chapter in the oral history of Cinder Hollow, a story whispered by grandparents to scare children into obedience. There was no arrest, no judge, no jury. The justice meted out that day inside the Lawson chapel was swift, brutal, and biblical. The men, their minds unhinged by grief and the profound betrayal, fell upon Alistair Blackwood. His cries for mercy were lost in the cacophony of their rage. They dragged him from the pulpit, the sacred space he had so horrifically desecrated, and the doors of the chapel were barred from the inside. Dr. Silas Croft, his duty done, stood outside, listening to the muffled, terrible sounds from within. He did not participate, but he did not intervene. He understood that this was not something law or reason could resolve. This was a cleansing, a primal act of vengeance against an evil so profound it defied all comprehension. No one ever spoke of the specifics of Blackwood's end, but his body was never found. Some said he was torn apart. Others whispered he was sealed, living in a makeshift tomb beneath the chapel's floorboards, buried in the unhallowed ground he had created. The only certainty is that when the chapel doors were finally unbarred hours later, the men who emerged were silent, their faces pale and splattered with blood, their eyes holding a haunted, vacant look that would never leave them. Alistair Blackwood had vanished from the earth, and the Lawson Chapel was now not just a place of death, but a place of damnation, consecrated by a final, macabre act of violence. The curse had been lifted, but the stain on their souls and on the very timbers of that building would remain forever. In the aftermath, a pall of unnatural silence fell over Cinder Hollow. The rage had been spent, but the grief and guilt remained, a festering wound in the heart of the community. The Lawson Chapel was abandoned immediately. No one dared to set foot inside it again. It stood as a monument to their collective trauma, a place so saturated with sorrow and violence that the very air around it felt heavy and cold. The families who had been followers of Blackwood were now pariahs, their devoutness recast as a foolish, fatal complicity. The Lawsons, in particular, bore the brunt of the unspoken blame. They had donated the land, championed the building of the chapel, and been the most ardent defenders of the man who turned out to be a monster. Their name was now inextricably linked to the macabre history of the place. They sold their farm for a pittance and left the valley within a month, disappearing into the vast anonymity of the Western Territories, forever running from a past that would always haunt them. Cinder Hollow itself never recovered. The bonds of trust and community, once the bedrock of their survival, had been irrevocably broken. Families drifted away, seeking places where the memories were not so sharp, where every shadow did not look like a gaunt man in a black coat. The valley slowly emptied, its lifeblood draining away, until only a few stubborn, haunted souls remained. The story of the Sermon deaths became a forbidden legend, a cold case that was never officially investigated because, in the eyes of the law, no crime had ever been committed. The children's deaths were still officially attributed to fever, and Reverend Alastair Blackwood simply vanished. History, it seemed, had chosen to forget. But the memory lingered in the mountains, as persistent and chilling as the winter wind. For years, the Lawson chapel stood empty and derelict, a decaying testament to the horror it had witnessed. The windows were shattered, the door hung from a single hinge, and the wild woods slowly began the process of reclaiming the land. Children from the few remaining families would dare each other to approach it, but none ever had the courage to go inside. They claimed that on quiet nights, you could hear whispers coming from within, the faint, ghostly echo of a sermon or the soft crying of a child. It became a place of local lore, a genuinely haunted location where the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead was unnervingly thin. Dr. Silas Croft remained in the area, a silent, solitary guardian of the truth. He never spoke of what he had discovered or the grim justice that followed. He carried the burden of that knowledge alone, and it aged him beyond his years. He was respected but also feared, seen as a man who had looked into the abyss and had a piece of it look back into him. He kept the small sample of the angel's shroud spores, wrapped in CL. Oth and sealed in a small tin box, a tangible reminder of the evil he had faced. It was his proof, a secret he would take to his grave. The official narrative remained one of tragedy and disease, a far more palatable story than the macabre reality of a charismatic predator who used faith as a weapon and a church as his killing field. The truth was simply too disturbing, too great a challenge to the fundamental beliefs of the people who had to continue living in the shadow of that cursed place. The story was banned, not by any official decree, but by a collective, unspoken agreement to bury the memory and let the ghosts of the past lie undisturbed. The ultimate fate of the Lawson Chapel added one final, macabre chapter to its legend. About a decade after the tragedy, on a dry, windless autumn night, the chapel caught fire. There was no storm, no lightning, no logical reason for the blaze. It simply erupted in flames, a furious inferno that lit up the entire valley. The few residents who remained gathered at a safe distance and simply watched it burn. They made no attempt to extinguish the flames. For them, this was not a disaster. It was an exorcism. They watched as the structure that had brought them so much pain was consumed, the timbers groaning like tormented souls as they collapsed into a heap of glowing embers. By morning, all that remained was a blackened scar on the earth, a smoldering pile of ash, and the chapel's stone foundation, which looked like the broken teeth of a skull. The fire was officially ruled an accident, cause unknown, but everyone in Cinder Hollow knew better. They believed it was the land itself, finally purging the evil that had stained it. Others whispered that it was the work of Silas Croft, a final act of closing the book on that horrifying chapter of his life. A more chilling rumor suggested it was the tormented spirits of the murdered children, finally rising up to destroy their prison. Whatever the cause, the destruction of the Lawson Chapel was the final act. The last physical evidence of the tragedy was gone, leaving only the story, the forbidden history that now passed entirely into the realm of folklore. The scar on the landscape eventually healed, covered over by grass and wildflowers, but the scar on the collective memory of the region would prove to be permanent. The mystery of Reverend Alastair Blackwood himself endures as the most disturbing part of this macabre tale. He was a phantom who drifted into Cinder Hollow and vanished just as mysteriously. After the events at the chapel, once word of the strange fever that had taken so many children had trickled out to the wider world, inquiries were made. Circuit judges and lawmen, hearing fragmented and superstitious rumors, tried to piece together the identity of the preacher. They found nothing. The letter of introduction he carried was from a diocese that did not exist. The name Alastair Blackwood appeared in no church records, no census data, no legal documents of any kind. It was as if the man had no past, no history before he arrived in the valley. Was Blackwood even his real name? Or was it an alias, one of many used by a transient predator who moved from one isolated community to the next, leaving a trail of death in his wake? The thought is horrifying. It recasts him from a singular monster into a recurring nightmare. How many other Cinder Hollows were there? How many other small, forgotten communities had welcomed a charismatic stranger, only to see their children die in inexplicable ways? We will likely never know. He was a ghost, a human void who embodied a pure, unadulterated form of malevolent narcissism. His motives seemed to transcend simple murder. He was not killing for gain or for passion in the traditional sense. He was a collector of souls, a man who derived a godlike power from the act of choosing who lived and who died, all while cloaked in the sacred vestments of a man of the cloth. This is the ultimate horror of his story. Not just what he did, but the chilling possibility that he did it before, and that after escaping Cinder Hollow, he simply moved on to do it again. Reflecting on the Cinder Hollow tragedy from a modern perspective opens up even more disturbing questions. Today, a figure like Alastair Blackwood would be classified as a specific type of serial killer, a medical or caretaker killer, though in his case, the care was spiritual. These are individuals who derive a thrill from the power of life and death, often operating in positions of trust. He perfectly fits the profile of a narcissistic sociopath with a messiah complex. His methods were cunning. His understanding of both human psychology and obscure poisons was sophisticated, and his ability to manipulate a community's deepest fears and beliefs was masterful. He didn't just kill. He orchestrated a piece of grand, macabre theater with himself as the star. He turned a congregation into his unwilling audience and their children in. To his props, the use of powdered mushroom spores as a murder weapon is particularly diabolical. It speaks to a level of cold, calculated planning that is truly terrifying. He had to find the fungus, identify it, learn how to safely process it into a fine powder, and devise a silent, airborne delivery system. This was not the work of a simple madman. It was the work of a criminal genius, a monster hiding in plain sight. The story serves as a chilling reminder of how vulnerable isolated communities were, and how easily a predator could exploit their faith and their lack of access to scientific knowledge and legal oversight. The Lawson Chapel tragedy is a cold case that chills to the bone because it represents a perfect storm of evil, isolation, and belief, a storm that allowed a monster to flourish, and whose true scale of horror may never be fully known. His story is a forbidden history that serves as a haunting lesson in the darkness that can hide behind a charismatic smile and a holy book. The psychological toll on the survivors of Cinder Hollow is a dimension of the tragedy that is often overlooked in the retelling of the macabre events. Consider the parents who were forced to live with the knowledge that they had willingly led their children into a slaughterhouse, Sunday after Sunday. Imagine the crushing weight of guilt carried by Jedediah Lawson, a man whose piety and dreams of a community church were the very catalysts for the horror. His faith, once a source of strength, became an instrument of his child's death. This kind of trauma doesn't just fade away. It becomes a part of the genetic memory of a family, a dark stain passed down through generations. Then there are the children who survived, the ones who sat in those pews and watched their friends and siblings fall into that strange, quiet stupor. What did they see? What did they remember? How did that experience shape their view of the world, of faith, of authority? They are the forgotten victims, the ones who lived but were never truly free of the Lawson Chapel's shadow. They would have grown into adults for whom the sound of a church bell might trigger a cold sweat, for whom a passionate sermon might sound like a death sentence. The entire community was afflicted with a form of collective PTSD, a deep-seated trauma that manifested as suspicion, paranoia, and a profound distrust of outsiders. The very social bonds that allow a community to thrive were poisoned, just as surely as the children were. This psychological devastation is, in many ways, Blackwood's most enduring legacy. He didn't just take 5 lives. He murdered the soul of an entire community, leaving behind a ghost town of haunted survivors. One of the most unsettling elements of this story is the sheer plausibility of the poison itself. The angel's shroud mushroom, as described in the story, bears a striking resemblance to real-world fungi, most notably those in the Amanita family, such as the destroying angel Amanita bisporigera or the death cap Amanita phalloides. While these mushrooms are famously toxic when ingested, causing liver and kidney failure after a period of delayed symptoms, the idea of using their dried, powdered spores as an inhalant poison is a truly terrifying innovation. Fungal spores are incredibly lightweight and can remain airborne for extended periods, easily traveling the short distance from a pulpit to the first few pews. Inhaled, they would bypass the digestive system and enter the bloodstream directly through the lungs, potentially leading to a much faster, more systemic, and harder-to-diagnose poisoning. The symptoms described in the story, neurological paralysis, a glassy-eyed stupor, and quiet respiratory failure, are consistent with certain types of potent neurotoxins found in the natural world. Blackwood's method was not magic or a supernatural curse. It was a sophisticated form of bioterrorism, waged on the most vulnerable members of a society that had no concept of such a thing. It's a chilling reminder that the deadliest weapons are often not forged in fire, but grown in the damp, dark places of the earth, waiting for a hand with the knowledge and malice to wield them. The historical accuracy of such a specific method is difficult to verify, which only adds to its power as a macabre legend. It exists in that horrifying space between what is known and what is terrifyingly possible. If you find these deep dives into the chilling specifics of historical cold cases fascinating, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. The forgotten details are often the most disturbing. The role of Dr. Silas Croft in this story cannot be overstated. He represents the voice of reason and science in a world consumed by superstition and religious hysteria. In an era when most deaths were simply attributed to the will of God, his refusal to accept the easy explanation, his insistence on looking for a physical cause, is what makes him a true hero. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, the old world of faith and folklore, and the emerging world of empirical evidence and medical investigation. His decision to consult with Granny Hoot, a figure from the world of superstition, to gain the scientific knowledge he needed, is a perfect illustration of this conflict. He was willing to risk his reputation and flirt with what his community would consider dark arts in the pursuit of a rational truth. His methodical investigation, observing the pattern, identifying the vector, searching for the source, and finally finding the proof, is a classic piece of detective work, made all the more remarkable by the time and place in which it occurred. He was a forensic investigator before the term even existed. Without Silas Croft, the deaths in Cinder Hollow would have remained an unsolved mystery, a curse that eventually faded into a bizarre local legend. Blackwood might have even continued his reign of terror unchecked. Silas provides a crucial lesson. In the face of inexplicable evil, blind faith is a liability. It is curiosity, skepticism, and the relentless pursuit of evidence that ultimately illuminates the darkness. He was the only one willing to ask the forbidden question: what if this isn't the work of God or the devil, but the work of a man? Let's consider for a moment a truly horrifying alternate possibility. What if Reverend Blackwood was not alone? The narrative of the lone, charismatic predator is compelling, but the history of such crimes often reveals networks or, at the very least, enabling forces. Blackwood's knowledge of obscure toxic fungi was highly specialized. Where did he acquire it? Was he part of some forgotten, nihilistic cult that saw mercy killing as a sacred duty? The idea of a secret society of such shepherds, moving through the frontier and rescuing the souls of children, is the stuff of nightmares, but it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility in the chaotic, often lawless landscape of 19th century America. This was a time of intense religious fervor and experimentation, with countless splinter sects and utopian communities forming and dissolving. Perhaps Blackwood was a product of one such group, a fanatic sent out to practice his horrifying version of salvation. This theory would also explain his complete lack of a verifiable past. He would have been raised within a closed, secretive society that existed entirely off the grid, leaving no records. It also raises a more chilling thought. Was his escape from Cinder Hollow aided by others? Did he have a prearranged escape route, a safe house to flee to? The idea that he was not just a lone wolf, but part of a larger, hidden evil, reframes the entire story. It suggests that the Cinder Hollow tragedy was not an isolated incident, but a single, discovered battle in a much larger, secret war being waged on the innocent. The evil that visited the Lawson Chapel may not have been born there, and it certainly may not have died there. The symbolism of the Lawson Chapel itself is central to the macabre power of this story. A church is meant to be the ultimate sanctuary, a place of safety, peace, and divine protection. It is the one place where a community should feel secure from the evils of the world. Blackwood's great crime, beyond the murders themselves, was the inversion of this sacred symbolism. He weaponized the sanctuary, turning the house of God into his personal abattoir. The pulpit, a symbol of truth and guidance, became a sniper's nest. The sermon, a vehicle for salvation, became the delivery system for poison. The communion of believers became a hunting ground. This profound act of desecration is what makes the story so deeply disturbing. It attacks our most fundamental assumptions about safety and sanctity. If you cannot be safe in a church, where can you be safe? Blackwood exploited the very rituals and architecture of faith to commit his crimes. The pews that arranged his victims for him, the acoustics that carried his hypnotic voice, the reverence that kept his congregation still and captive. He used every element of the sacred space to his advantage. The final act of the community, the violent reckoning inside the chapel and its eventual burning, can be seen as a desperate attempt to reclaim that symbolism. By destroying the building, they were trying to erase the stain of its defilement, to purify the land through fire. But the story shows that some desecrations are too profound to be cleansed. The blackened foundation of the Lawson Chapel serves as a permanent reminder that the most horrifying evils are often those that disguise themselves in the robes of righteousness and operate from the very places we trust the most. Let us explore the character of Jedediah Lawson more deeply. He is, in many ways, the story's most tragic figure, even more so than the children. The children were innocent victims, their lives cut short before they could truly begin. But Jedediah lived on, forced to carry the full weight of the consequences. His journey is a horrifying study in cognitive dissonance. He is a good man, a pious man whose deepest desires, to serve God and protect his family, are twisted into the instruments of his own destruction. When his daughter Elspeth dies, he is faced with a terrible choice. Believe that his brand new church is cursed and his chosen pastor is evil, or accept it as God's mysterious will. For a man of his time and faith, the latter is the only sane option. He clings to his belief in Blackwood because the alternative is too monstrous to contemplate. He has to believe, otherwise he would have to admit that his own actions led to his daughter's death. Blackwood understands this psychology perfectly and exploits it, making Jedediah his most ardent defender. The moment of revelation in the chapel, when Silas reveals the poison, is therefore not just a moment of shock for Jedediah, but the complete and utter collapse of his entire worldview. The man he defended is a monster, the church he built is a tomb, and his faith has been a fool's errand. His subsequent flight from the valley is not just an escape from the judgment of his neighbors, but an escape from himself. He is a man running from a truth he can no longer deny, that in his search for God, he had invited the devil in for supper. The story of the Lawson Chapel can be seen as a uniquely American Gothic tale. It taps into the specific fears and anxieties of the American frontier experience. The setting itself is a key character, the vast, untamed wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. This was a place that was beautiful but also deeply menacing, a place where civilization felt like a fragile outpost surrounded by an ocean of darkness. In this environment, religion was not a casual affair. It was a desperately needed shield against the chaos, both external and internal. The isolation of Cinder Hollow is crucial. It creates a closed system, an echo chamber where a charismatic figure like Blackwood can exert immense psychological control without any outside scrutiny. There is no sheriff nearby, no competing church, no newspaper to question the strange events. In this vacuum of authority, Blackwood becomes the sole arbiter of truth and reality for his followers. The story preys on the fear of the other, the dangerous stranger who looks civilized but carries a hidden, savage darkness. Blackwood is the ultimate boogeyman of the frontier, the wolf in shepherd's clothing, the smooth-talking charlatan from back east who comes to exploit the trust of the simple country folk. It's a macabre folk tale that speaks to a deep-seated American anxiety about the conflict between community and isolation, faith and fanaticism, and the terrifying possibility that the greatest threat is not the wilderness outside, but the darkness that can be welcomed right through the front door. The absence of a body is a masterstroke of macabre storytelling, both within the legend and for us as listeners. The fact that Alistair Blackwood's corpse was never found prevents any true sense of closure and allows him to transcend from a mere mortal killer into a supernatural figure of evil. By vanishing, he retains a measure of his power. He becomes a ghost, a specter that haunts Cinder Hollow forever. Did the townsfolk truly dispose of his body so completely that no trace was ever found? Or, in the chaos and fury of that final confrontation, did he somehow manage to escape? This ambiguity is terrifying. The thought that he might have slipped away, wounded but alive, to continue his ministry elsewhere is perhaps more horrifying than his death. It means the evil was not contained and destroyed in the chapel. It was merely displaced. This unresolved ending is what elevates the story from a simple historical crime to a chilling piece of folklore. It leaves the listener with a lingering sense of unease. The monster was unmasked, but was he truly vanquished? The empty space where his body should be is a vacuum that gets filled with our worst fears. It allows Blackwood to become a legend, a story you tell to scare people, a name you whisper in the dark. In a way, by denying them a body to bury, he achieved a twisted form of immortality, forever haunting the dark woods and hollows of our imagination. The tale of Lawson Chapel is a cold case not just because the crimes went unrecorded, but because the ultimate fate of its perpetrator remains a disturbing, and perhaps eternal, mystery. What can be found today at the site of the Lawson Chapel? For those who search for the dark and forgotten corners of history, the answer is both disappointing and deeply unsettling. Cinder Hollow itself has been largely reclaimed by the wilderness. The farms have vanished, the cabins have rotted into the earth, and the old roads are now little more than deer trails. The community is gone, but if one knows exactly where to look, guided by old maps and local lore, it is possible to find the chapel's foundation stones. They lie in a small, overgrown clearing, a rectangle of moss-covered rocks forming a ghostly footprint of the building that once stood there. The air in the clearing is said to be unnaturally still and cold, even on the hottest summer day. Local legend claims that nothing will grow within the perimeter of the foundation. The soil is permanently soured by the events that transpired there. There are no plaques, no markers, no official acknowledgement that anything ever happened. There is only the silent, brooding forest and the quiet testimony of the stones. It is a place utterly saturated with a sense of loss and tragedy. To stand there is to feel the immense weight of the past, the echoes of a charismatic voice delivering sermons of death, the silent screams of terrified parents, and the ghostly presence of the children for whom this was the last place on earth they ever saw. It is a truly forbidden place, where history and horror have become one, a cold case that the land itself seems determined to remember, even as the world of men has chosen to forget. The story of the Lawson Chapel is, in the end, a chilling parable about the nature of evil. It demonstrates how evil does not always arrive with horns and a pitchfork. Often it comes with a welcoming smile, a captivating voice, and a promise of salvation. Alistair Blackwood was a monster, but his greatest weapon was not the poison he carried, but the trust he inspired. He held up a mirror to the deepest fears and hopes of the people of Cinder Hollow, and reflected back a version of reality that they so desperately wanted to believe. He understood that people will often accept the most horrifying explanation if it is cloaked in the comforting language of faith. The tale is a macabre reminder that the line between devotion and delusion can be terrifyingly thin, and that the same human need for answers and meaning that can lead to great works of art and acts of charity can also be twisted into a tool of unimaginable cruelty. The records of Reverend Alistair Blackwood, if that was even his name, were never found. It is as if he, and the specific, articulate evil he brought with him, simply dissolved back into the shadows of the American frontier. Perhaps waiting for the next desperate flock, in the next isolated valley, in need of a shepherd to lead them through the darkness.